Imagine waking up before the sun has even touched the horizon, not to the sound of an alarm, but to the distant call of a rooster echoing across stone walls still cool from the desert night. Imagine opening your eyes in a room no larger than a modern closet, lying on a straw mat spread across a packed earth floor, with the faint scent of olive oil lamps still lingering in the air from the night before. Imagine stepping outside, barefoot, onto narrow streets made of crushed limestone, where the first merchants are already unrolling their goods, and the smell of fresh bread drifts from a clay oven built into the wall of a neighboring house. This was not a fantasy. This was not a myth. This was daily life in a biblical city 2,000 years ago, and what you're about to hear will change the way you understand the ancient world forever. What it was like to live in a biblical city, daily life 2,000 years ago, explained in detail now. His name was Tobias, and he was born in the lower quarter of a city that sat on the edge of a trade route, connecting the great empires of the ancient world. The city was not large by modern standards. Its walls enclosed perhaps 40 acres of land, enough to hold a few thousand people. But within those walls existed a universe of human experience as rich and complicated as anything found in the most modern metropolis. Tobias was the son of a potter, a man named Hezron, who had inherited his workshop from his own father and his father before him. In a world where family names meant everything, where your trade was your identity and your neighborhood was your tribe, Tobias was born into a life already mapped out for him before he ever took his first breath. The house where Tobias grew up was typical of the period. It was built from rough-cut limestone blocks, with walls about 18 inches thick, designed to keep out the brutal heat of summer and the surprising cold of winter nights. The roof was flat, made of wooden beams covered with packed mud and straw, and it served as an extra room for the family. In the evenings, when the air below became stifling, the entire family would climb a crude wooden ladder to the rooftop, where they would lay out their sleeping mats and talk beneath a sky so full of stars it looked like scattered grain across a threshing floor. There was no glass in the windows. Instead, wooden shutters kept out the wind and the occasional stray animal that wandered through the streets at night. Inside the house, there was no furniture as we would recognize it. No chairs, no tables, no beds with frames. The family sat on the floor, ate on the floor, and slept on the floor. A low stone bench ran along one wall, and this served as both a seat during the day and a sleeping platform at night. In one corner sat a small clay stove, barely larger than a modern bucket, where Tobias's mother, a woman named Miriam, would cook the family's meals using dried dung and small bundles of thorny brush as fuel. Wood was scarce and expensive, a luxury reserved for the wealthy or for special occasions. The stove produced a thin, acrid smoke that darkened the ceiling over years, leaving a permanent black stain that told the story of 10,000 meals prepared in quiet devotion. Miriam rose before anyone else in the house, every single day without exception. Her first task was to grind grain. This was not a simple chore. It was a physical labor so demanding that it shaped the muscles of her arms and back in ways that would be visible to anyone who looked. She used a saddle quern, a heavy stone tool consisting of a large flat base stone and a smaller rounded stone that she would push back and forth with both hands, crushing wheat or barley into flour. The sound of grinding stones was one of the defining sounds of any biblical city. It started before dawn and continued through the morning, a rhythmic, almost musical scraping that echoed through every neighborhood. When that sound stopped, it meant something was terribly wrong. It meant a household had been struck by illness or poverty so deep that there was no grain left to grind. From the flour, Miriam would make flatbread. She mixed the ground grain with water and a pinch of salt, kneaded it quickly, and slapped it onto the interior wall of a clay oven called a tanner, where it baked in minutes. The bread was thin, round, and slightly charred on one side. It served as plate, utensil, and staple food all at once. A family like Tobias's would eat bread with nearly every meal, tearing off pieces and dipping them into small bowls of olive oil, or wiping them through dishes of lentils and herbs. Bread was so central to life that it became a symbol of life itself, a metaphor so powerful that it echoed through religious texts and cultural memory for millennia. Tobias's father, Hezron, would wake shortly after Miriam, wash his face and hands from a small stone basin near the door, and make his way to the workshop. The pottery workshop was attached to the house, a common arrangement in a city where commercial and domestic life were inseparable. The workshop contained a kickwheel, a simple device consisting of a heavy stone disc at the bottom that Hezron would spin with his foot while shaping wet clay on a smaller disc above. The clay came from deposits found in the valley below the city, carried up in heavy baskets by laborers or by the potters themselves. Hezron could produce dozens of vessels in a single day, from small oil lamps no bigger than a man's palm to large storage jars capable of holding 30 gallons of wine or grain. Each piece had to be dried carefully in the shade, then fired in a kiln built into the hillside behind the workshop. The kiln was fueled by whatever combustible material was available, and firing day was an event that required the help of neighbors and the careful attention of the entire family, because a badly managed firing could destroy weeks of work in a matter of hours. Young Tobias spent his earliest years at his mother's side. This was universal in the ancient world. Children belonged to their mothers until they were old enough to begin learning a trade, usually around the age of 5 or 6. Tobias would sit on the floor of the house while Miriam worked, playing with clay scraps from his father's workshop, or chasing the family's chickens around the small courtyard that separated the house from the street. The courtyard was shared with 2 other families, and it was the center of social life for the women and children of the neighborhood. Here, women would gather to wash clothes in stone basins, to gossip, to share news, to settle disputes, and to watch each other's children with a collective attention that made every child in the courtyard everyone's responsibility. The courtyard also contained the household's most precious resource, a cistern. Water was life, and in a city that received rain only during certain months of the year, the ability to collect and store water was the difference between survival and catastrophe. The cistern was carved into the bedrock beneath the courtyard, plastered on the inside to prevent leakage, and covered with a large stone slab to keep out dust, insects, and animals. Rainwater was channeled from the rooftops through small stone gutters that directed it into the cistern below. A family's wealth could be measured in many ways, but one of the most reliable was the size and condition of its cistern. A large, well-maintained cistern meant security. A cracked or shallow one meant anxiety, rationing, and dependence on the city's public water sources, which were always crowded and often controlled by those with political power. Tobias learned to carry water before he learned to shape clay. His mother would send him to the public fountain near the market square, a stone structure fed by an aqueduct that brought water from a spring several miles outside the city walls. He would carry a clay jar on his shoulder, walking carefully through the narrow streets, stepping over drainage channels carved into the stone pavement, dodging donkeys loaded with goods, and navigating the constant flow of people that made every street feel alive with motion and sound. The water jar was heavy, even when empty, and nearly unbearable when full. Tobias would make this trip 2 or 3 times a day, and by the age of 8, his shoulders were already developing the asymmetrical strength that came from years of carrying heavy loads on one side of his body. Confira-se já é inscrito neste canal, porque here we bring ancient history to life in ways you have never experienced before, revealing the real stories behind the civilizations that shaped everything you know today. Subscribe now so you never miss a single revelation. By the time Tobias reached his 10th year, his world had expanded beyond the courtyard and the water fountain. Hezron began teaching him the craft of pottery, and this education was far more than technical instruction. It was an initiation into manhood, into identity, into the social fabric of the city itself. In a biblical city, a man without a trade was a man without a place. He was invisible, untethered, a wanderer, even if he never left the city walls. The craft of pottery connected Tobias to a lineage that stretched back generations, and it connected him to a network of relationships that would define his adult life. The clay suppliers, the fuel gatherers, the merchants who would sell his goods, the families who would use his vessels in their daily rituals of cooking, eating, storing, and worshipping. The market was the beating heart of the city, and it was here that Tobias truly began to understand the complexity of the world he lived in. The main market occupied an open square near the center of the city, flanked on 3 sides by stone colonnades where merchants set up their stalls each morning. The variety of goods was astonishing. There were spice merchants whose stalls filled the air with the scent of cinnamon, cumin, coriander, and saffron, spices that had traveled thousands of miles along trade routes stretching from the Far East. There were cloth merchants displaying bolts of linen and wool, dyed in deep reds, blues, and purples. The most expensive colors derived from rare shellfish found along the Mediterranean coast. There were metalworkers selling bronze tools and iron implements, leather workers offering sandals and belts, and food vendors selling dried fish, smoked meat, fresh figs, dates, pomegranates, and olives in quantities that seemed almost obscene in a land where scarcity was always just one bad harvest away. Money existed, but it was not the simple system of coins and bills that we know today. The primary currency in Tobias's world was the silver shekel, a small coin that represented a significant amount of purchasing power. Most daily transactions, however, were conducted through barter. A potter might exchange a dozen oil lamps for a basket of figs, or trade a large storage jar for a length of cloth. The value of goods was negotiated in every transaction, and the market was alive with the sound of haggling, a ritualized verbal dance in which buyer and seller would express exaggerated outrage, feigned indifference, and theatrical emotion before arriving at a price that both considered fair. Tobias watched his father navigate these negotiations with a skill that bordered on artistry, and he understood that success in the market required not just good products, but good relationships, a sharp memory, and the ability to read the intentions behind another person's words. The social structure of the city was rigidly hierarchical, though not in the way modern people might imagine. At the top were the priestly families and the landed aristocracy, families who owned large estates outside the city walls and who controlled much of the city's religious and political life. Below them were the merchants and master craftsmen, men like Hezron who owned their own workshops and employed apprentices. Below them were the laborers, men who worked for daily wages in construction, agriculture, or transport. And at the bottom were those who had fallen out of the system entirely, the destitute, the disabled, those who had lost their land or their family connections, and who survived on charity, begging, or occasional work. Women occupied a separate but parallel hierarchy. A woman's status was determined primarily by her husband's position and by her own family's reputation. Miriam, as the wife of a respected craftsman, held a position of moderate standing. She was consulted on household decisions, managed the family's food stores, oversaw the education of the younger children, and maintained the social relationships that kept the family connected to the broader community. But her world was largely confined to the domestic sphere. She did not go to the market alone, did not participate in public religious ceremonies in the same way men did, and did not have legal standing independent of her husband or her father. This was not cruelty or neglect. It was the structure of a world in which survival depended on clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and in which the household, not the individual, was the fundamental unit of society. There was a young woman in the upper quarter of the city whose name was Naomi. She was the daughter of a textile merchant, a man of considerable wealth who had built his fortune importing fine linen from Egypt and selling it to the families of priests and aristocrats. Naomi had grown up in a house far larger than Tobias's, with multiple rooms, a private courtyard, and a rooftop garden where her mother grew herbs and flowers. She had been educated beyond what was typical for a girl of her time. Her father, a man of unusual views, had allowed her to learn to read and write, skills that gave her access to a world of ideas and stories that most women of her generation would never know. Tobias first saw Naomi at the public fountain on a festival day, when the usual social barriers loosened slightly and people from different quarters of the city mingled more freely than usual. She was carrying a decorated water jar, painted with geometric patterns that Tobias recognized immediately as the work of a rival pottery workshop. He noticed her hands first, long-fingered and graceful, nothing like the rough, calloused hands of the women in his own neighborhood. She noticed him staring and looked away quickly, but not before their eyes met for a fraction of a second that contained, in its silent electricity, the seed of everything that would follow. It would be weeks before they spoke, and when they did, it was through the mediation of the market. Naomi's family needed new storage jars for the upcoming olive harvest, and her father sent a servant to Hezron's workshop to place an order. Tobias, now 15 and increasingly responsible for the business side of the workshop, handled the transaction. When the jars were delivered to Naomi's house, Tobias carried them himself, refusing to send an apprentice. He arrived at the gate of her family's courtyard, announced himself, and waited. It was Naomi who came to inspect the delivery, accompanied by a younger sister who giggled behind her hand the entire time. The conversation was brief and formal. Naomi examined the jars with an eye that surprised Tobias. She ran her fingers along the rims, checked the thickness of the walls, and tapped the sides to listen for the clear ring that indicated a well-fired vessel. She knew quality. She asked Tobias about the clay source, about the firing temperature, about the glaze. He answered with a thoroughness that betrayed his desire to impress her, offering details about his craft that he would never share with a regular customer. When the inspection was complete, Naomi nodded her approval and said simply, "These will serve well." Tobias left with a payment of silver coins and a sensation in his chest that he had never experienced before, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. The seasons in a biblical city were not mere changes in weather. They were the organizing principle of all life, the rhythm to which every human activity was set. The agricultural calendar dictated everything: when to plant, when to harvest, when to celebrate, and when to mourn. In the fall, the first rains came, and the entire city seemed to exhale with relief after the long, dry summer. The rains softened the earth, filled the cisterns, and turned the brown hillsides around the city into a carpet of green so vivid it looked almost artificial. Farmers outside the walls plowed their fields and planted wheat and barley, while inside the city, families began the work of pressing olives and grapes, the two great harvests that provided oil for cooking, lighting, and ritual, and wine for drinking, trading, and celebrating. The olive harvest was a communal event that brought the entire city together. Families who owned olive groves outside the walls would hire laborers to beat the branches with long sticks, knocking the ripe olives to the ground where they were gathered into baskets and carried to the press. The olive press was a massive stone device, often shared by several families, consisting of a large circular basin where the olives were crushed by a heavy stone wheel turned by a donkey or by human muscle. The resulting paste was placed in woven baskets that were stacked and pressed under enormous weight, squeezing out the golden green oil that was, quite literally, the lifeblood of the ancient economy. Olive oil was used for everything: cooking, lamp fuel, medicine, cosmetics, religious ceremonies, and trade. A family with a good olive grove was a family with security, and the quality of a household's olive oil was a source of tremendous pride. Tobias's family did not own olive trees, but Hezron had a long-standing arrangement with a farmer named Jotham, who lived just outside the city walls. In exchange for a year's supply of pottery, Jotham provided the family with enough olive oil to meet their needs and a small surplus that Miriam could trade in the market for other necessities. This kind of reciprocal arrangement was the glue that held the community together. In a world without banks, insurance, or government safety nets, survival depended on a web of mutual obligations that connected families across social boundaries. You helped your neighbor in his time of need, because you knew that your own time of need was always just around the corner. The grape harvest followed the olives, and it was accompanied by a festive atmosphere that was one of the highlights of the year. Grapes were trampled in stone vats by barefoot workers, usually young men and women who sang and laughed as they stomped the fruit into juice. The juice was collected in large clay jars and left to ferment in cool underground chambers carved into the rock beneath the city. The wine that resulted was not the refined beverage that modern people might imagine. It was rough, often sour, and usually diluted with water before drinking. But it was an essential part of daily life, consumed at every meal, offered to guests as a sign of hospitality, and used in religious rituals that connected the community to its deepest traditions. It was during the grape harvest that Tobias and Naomi found opportunities to see each other more frequently. The festival atmosphere created a social space where young people from different families and neighborhoods could interact with a freedom that was impossible during the rest of the year. Tobias would position himself near the wine press where Naomi's family brought their grapes, and they would exchange glances and brief words that carried enormous weight in a culture where every interaction between unmarried men and women was observed and interpreted by the community. One evening during a harvest celebration, Tobias found himself standing next to Naomi at the edge of the dancing circle. The music was provided by a small group of musicians playing clay drums, wooden flutes, and a stringed instrument called a kinnor, whose sound was somewhere between a modern guitar and a harp. The melody was ancient and repetitive, designed not for performance but for participation, and the dancers moved in simple, synchronized steps that even children could follow. Tobias did not dance. He was too nervous, too aware of Naomi's presence beside him. She turned to him and said, "You are the potter's son, the one who brought the storage jars." He nodded. She smiled, and the moonlight caught her face in a way that made Tobias's heart feel like it was trying to escape his chest. They talked for nearly an hour, standing at the edge of the celebration while the rest of the city danced and drank and laughed. Naomi told Tobias about the scrolls her father kept in a wooden chest in his study, texts that described the histories of kingdoms and the philosophies of distant cultures. She spoke about them with a passion that surprised Tobias, who had never met a woman who discussed ideas with such confidence. He told her about the pottery, about the way clay responded to the touch of a skilled hand, about the moment when a shapeless lump of earth became a vessel capable of holding water or wine or oil. He described it as a kind of transformation, a process that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. And Naomi listened with an attention that made him feel, for the first time in his life, that he was more than just a craftsman following in his father's footsteps. Right now, I want you to pause for a moment and think about a time in your life when a single conversation changed everything. That moment when someone truly saw you for who you were. Write it in the comments below. Share your story. Because 2,000 years may have passed, but that feeling, that electric recognition between two souls, has not changed at all. But their connection existed in a world that did not easily accommodate personal desire. Naomi's father had already begun negotiations for her marriage to the son of a wealthy landowner, a match that would strengthen his business and elevate his family's social position. Marriage in a biblical city was not primarily a matter of personal affection. It was an economic and social alliance between families, negotiated by fathers and formalized through a contract that specified the bride price, the dowry, and the obligations of both parties. Love, when it existed, was expected to grow within the marriage, not to precede it. The idea that two young people might choose each other based on personal attraction was not forbidden, but it was considered impractical, even reckless, in a world where the survival of the family depended on strategic alliances. Tobias knew this. He understood the rules of his world with a clarity that made his feelings for Naomi feel dangerous, like carrying a flame through a room full of dry straw. He was the son of a potter, a craftsman of modest means. Naomi was the daughter of a merchant whose wealth placed him just below the aristocracy. The distance between their families was not measured in streets or neighborhoods, but in generations of accumulated status and wealth. To approach Naomi's father with a marriage proposal would require Tobias to offer a bride price that was beyond his means. And even if he could somehow gather the money, the social gap between the families would make the match scandalous. As the months passed, Tobias threw himself into his work with an intensity that surprised even Hezron. He woke before dawn, worked the wheel until his hands were raw, and experimented with new techniques that he had observed in the market from visiting craftsmen. He developed a distinctive style, a way of shaping the rim of a vessel that gave it an elegant, almost musical curve. He began producing pieces of such quality that they attracted attention from merchants who had previously ignored his family's workshop. Orders increased, revenue grew. Hezron, who had spent his entire life producing functional, unremarkable pottery, watched his son's ambition with a mixture of pride and unease. The city itself was changing during this period, though the changes were subtle and easy to miss if you were not paying attention. The great empire that controlled the region was tightening its grip, imposing new taxes, building new roads, and bringing in administrators who understood efficiency, but not tradition. A new governor had arrived, a man who spoke a foreign language and who viewed the city and its people as resources to be managed rather than communities to be respected. The taxes were not crushing, but they were constant, a steady drain on families that were already living close to the edge. The market felt the pressure. Prices rose. Barter became more common as silver coins became harder to come by. Some families began selling land to pay their debts, a process that concentrated wealth in fewer and fewer hands and pushed more people into the ranks of the laborers and the destitute. Tobias felt these pressures acutely. Every coin he earned went into a clay jar that he kept hidden beneath the floor of the workshop. He was saving for the bride price, though he had told no one about his intentions, not even his mother, who would have been sympathetic but practical, counseling him to forget Naomi and accept a match from his own social class. The amount he needed was staggering, more than a year's income from the workshop, and even as his savings grew, so did his awareness that the economic pressure on his family might force him to use the money for other purposes, to pay taxes, to buy grain during a shortage, to repair the kiln that was showing signs of structural damage. During this time, Tobias developed a friendship with a man named Caleb, a stonemason who worked on the construction projects that the new governor was commissioning throughout the city. Caleb was 10 years older than Tobias, a broad-shouldered man with a deep laugh and a practical wisdom that came from years of physical labor and careful observation. He had traveled more than most men in the city, having worked on building projects in 3 different provinces, and his stories of distant places and different customs gave Tobias a window into a world beyond the city walls that he had never seriously imagined. Caleb was also the first person outside his family to whom Tobias confided his feelings for Naomi. They were sitting on the rooftop of Caleb's house one evening, sharing a jar of wine and watching the sunset behind the western hills, turning the sky into a canvas of orange and purple that seemed to set the entire horizon on fire. Tobias spoke haltingly at first, embarrassed by his own vulnerability, but Caleb listened without judgment, nodding occasionally and refilling their cups in silence. When Tobias finished, Caleb sat quietly for a long moment, then said, "The problem is not that you are a potter and she is a merchant's daughter. The problem is that you think the distance between those things is fixed. In this city, nothing is fixed. Fortunes rise and fall like the rain. What matters is whether you have the courage to act when the moment comes." The moment came sooner than Tobias expected, and it came not through romance, but through crisis. In the early spring, a severe storm damaged the aqueduct that supplied the city's public fountain. The repairs took weeks, and during that time, the only reliable water source was a secondary spring located at the base of the eastern wall, a difficult and sometimes dangerous place to reach, especially for women and children who had to navigate a steep, rocky path while carrying heavy jars. The shortage affected everyone, but it hit the lower quarters hardest, where families had smaller cisterns and fewer resources to buy water from private vendors who quickly appeared, charging exorbitant prices for a basic necessity. Tobias organized a group of young men from his neighborhood to create a water-carrying brigade, ferrying water from the eastern spring to the homes of families who could not make the journey themselves: the elderly, the sick, the mothers with young children. It was exhausting work, but it earned Tobias something more valuable than money: a reputation. People in the neighborhood began to speak of him not just as Hezron's son, the potter, but as Tobias, the one who helped during the shortage. In a city where reputation was currency, this was an investment that would pay dividends for years. Naomi heard about Tobias's efforts through the network of women's conversation that connected every household in the city. Her own family had not suffered during the shortage. Their large cistern and private connections ensured an adequate supply, but she was moved by the stories of Tobias's generosity. She mentioned him to her father one evening during the family meal, casually, as if sharing general news about the city. Her father, Eleazar, listened with the attentive ear of a merchant who understood that every piece of information had potential value. He said nothing in response, but he remembered the name. The aqueduct was eventually repaired, the water crisis passed, and life returned to its familiar rhythms. But something had shifted. Tobias had demonstrated a quality that transcended his social position, a capacity for leadership and selflessness that the community recognized and valued. Hezron noticed the change in the way neighbors greeted him in the market, with a new warmth and respect that reflected favorably on the entire family. Miriam, who had the intuitive understanding of social dynamics that characterized the women of her generation, sensed an opportunity, though she kept her thoughts to herself and waited. The daily life of the city continued with its endless, intricate routines. Every morning, the sounds of grinding stones and roosters. Every afternoon, the bustle of the market, the smell of spices and animal dung, the shouts of vendors and the patient negotiations of buyers. Every evening, the gathering of families on their rooftops, the murmur of conversation, the laughter of children, and the gradual settling of the city into the deep, star-filled silence of a world without artificial light. In these moments, when the last lamp was extinguished and the only illumination came from the moon and the vast canopy of stars, the city revealed its most profound quality: the intimate connection between human life and the natural world. Every person in the city lived in direct relationship with the sun, the rain, the seasons, and the soil. There was no buffer, no insulation, no technology to mediate between the human body and the physical environment. You felt the heat, you felt the cold, you felt the rain on your skin and the dust in your lungs and the weight of every jar of water you carried and every stone you lifted. Life was physical in a way that modern people can barely imagine, and this physicality created a relationship with the world that was both brutal and beautiful. The following year brought a development that no one in the city anticipated. The governor announced a major construction project, a new public building near the center of the city that would serve as an administrative headquarters for the imperial government. The project was massive, requiring hundreds of laborers and craftsmen, and it would take months to complete. For the workers, it meant steady employment and reliable wages. For the merchants, it meant increased demand for materials and supplies. For the city's political leaders, it meant a new symbol of foreign authority planted in the heart of their community. Caleb was hired immediately, his reputation as a skilled mason making him one of the most sought-after workers on the project. He urged Tobias to submit a bid to supply pottery for the construction, specifically the clay pipes that would be needed for the building's drainage system and the decorative tiles that would adorn its facade. It was a lucrative contract, far larger than anything Tobias had ever attempted, and it would require him to expand his workshop, hire additional workers, and produce at a scale that tested the limits of his abilities. Tobias hesitated. The contract represented an opportunity to transform his family's fortunes, but it also carried risks. If he failed to deliver on time, or if the quality did not meet the governor's standards, the consequences could be severe, from financial ruin to public disgrace. Hezron counseled caution. He had spent his entire life avoiding risk, producing reliable work for reliable customers, and he could not understand his son's desire to gamble everything on a single contract. But Tobias had learned something during the water crisis that his father had never fully grasped: that caution and ambition were not opposites, but partners, and that the greatest risk of all was the risk of never trying. He submitted the bid, and after weeks of anxious waiting, he was awarded the contract. The next several months were the most intense of his life. He hired 3 additional workers, young men from the neighborhood who were eager for steady employment. He expanded the kiln, building a second firing chamber that doubled his capacity. He negotiated new agreements with clay suppliers, securing larger quantities at better prices by committing to long-term purchases. He worked from before dawn until well after dark, his hands constantly wet with clay, his mind constantly calculating quantities, schedules, and costs. The work was demanding, but it was also exhilarating. Tobias discovered in himself a capacity for organization and leadership that he had not known he possessed. He learned to manage people, to delegate tasks, to solve problems quickly, and to maintain quality under pressure. The drainage pipes he produced were precisely measured, uniform in thickness, and fired to a hardness that exceeded the specifications. The decorative tiles were more challenging, requiring artistic skill as well as technical precision, but Tobias rose to the challenge, creating designs that drew on traditional patterns while incorporating subtle innovations that gave them a distinctive character. Caleb, working on the construction site, kept Tobias informed about the progress of the building and the mood of the governor's administrators. The relationship between the city's residents and the imperial authorities was tense, marked by mutual suspicion and cultural misunderstanding. The workers resented the long hours and the dismissive attitude of the foreign overseers. The administrators complained about the slow pace of work and the tendency of local craftsmen to prioritize quality over speed. Caleb navigated this tension with the skill of a man who had learned to work within systems he could not change, doing his job well, keeping his opinions to himself, and maintaining his dignity through the simple act of producing excellent work. The construction project brought Tobias into contact with people and situations that expanded his understanding of the world. He met craftsmen from other cities who used different techniques and materials. He learned about architectural styles that he had never seen. He observed the administrative machinery of the empire up close, the systematic way in which resources were allocated, records were kept, and decisions were made. It was a system of tremendous power and efficiency, but it was also cold, impersonal, and indifferent to the individual lives it affected. One afternoon, while delivering a shipment of tiles to the construction site, Tobias encountered Naomi's father, Eleazar, who was there to discuss a contract for linen curtains that would hang in the building's main hall. Eleazar recognized Tobias immediately and greeted him with a warmth that surprised the young potter. They spoke for several minutes, discussing the progress of the construction, the quality of local materials, and the challenges of working with imperial administrators. Eleazar was impressed by Tobias's knowledge and by the quiet confidence with which he spoke about his work. Before they parted, Eleazar said something that sent a jolt through Tobias's entire body. He said, "I have heard good things about you, young man. My daughter speaks well of you. Come to our house for the Sabbath meal this week. My family would welcome your company." Tobias accepted the invitation with a composure that concealed the storm of emotions raging inside him. He walked home in a state of heightened awareness, noticing everything around him with an almost painful clarity. The way the late afternoon light turned the limestone walls golden, the sound of children playing in a courtyard, the smell of bread baking in a nearby oven, the feel of the packed earth beneath his sandals. The world seemed simultaneously more real and more dreamlike than it had ever been, as if the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary had suddenly become transparent. The Sabbath meal at Eleazar's house was an experience that Tobias would remember for the rest of his life. The house was beautiful in ways that his own home was not through luxury or ostentation, but through a careful attention to proportion, light, and space that reflected the aesthetic sensibility of a family that valued beauty as a form of respect for life itself. The main room was large enough to accommodate the entire family and their guests, with cushions arranged around a low table set with ceramic dishes of remarkable quality. Tobias noted the dishes with professional appreciation. They were not local work. They had been imported, probably from a coastal workshop known for its fine glazes and elegant forms. Naomi was present, seated beside her mother and younger sisters, dressed in a linen garment of such fineness that it seemed to glow in the lamplight. She greeted Tobias with a formal politeness that gave no indication of their previous conversations, but when their eyes met across the room, the connection was unmistakable, a current of understanding and affection that passed between them like a shared secret. The meal was generous and varied, featuring dishes that Tobias had never tasted. Roasted lamb seasoned with herbs, a salad of fresh greens dressed with olive oil and vinegar, a stew of lentils and onions flavored with cumin, flatbread made from fine wheat flour, and a honey cake for dessert that was so delicious it seemed like a revelation. Wine was served in modest quantities, diluted with water as was the custom, and the conversation was warm, intelligent, and wide-ranging. Eleazar drew Tobias out with skillful questions about his work, his family, and his ambitions. Tobias answered honestly, without boasting or false modesty, describing his plans to expand the workshop and his desire to produce pottery that would be recognized for its quality throughout the region. Eleazar listened with the attentive concentration of a man who was not just making conversation, but making an assessment, evaluating not just the words, but the character behind them. By the end of the evening, something had been decided, not formally, not explicitly, but in the wordless communication between a father who wanted the best for his daughter and a young man who had proven himself worthy of consideration. Walking home through the dark streets, guided only by the light of a nearly full moon, Tobias felt a lightness that he had never experienced before. The city around him was quiet, the houses dark, the streets empty except for a stray dog that followed him for a block before losing interest and disappearing into an alley. The air was cool and carried the scent of night-blooming flowers from a garden somewhere nearby. Above him, the stars were so bright and numerous that they seemed to exert a gentle pressure on his skin, as if the universe itself was leaning in to witness this moment in the life of a young potter who was learning that the world was larger and more generous than he had ever dared to believe. The negotiations for the marriage took 3 months. Eleazar, despite his growing respect for Tobias, was a businessman who did not make decisions based solely on sentiment. He investigated Tobias's family thoroughly, inquiring about their debts, their reputation, their connections, and their prospects. He consulted with other merchants and craftsmen who had done business with Hezron's workshop, and the reports he received were uniformly positive. Tobias was known as a man of integrity, skill, and ambition, a combination that Eleazar valued above wealth or social position. The bride price was set at a level that was challenging but achievable for Tobias, reflecting Eleazar's desire to test the young man's commitment without making the match impossible. Tobias used the savings he had accumulated from the construction contract, supplemented by additional income from new orders that continued to flow in as his reputation grew. Hezron contributed a portion as well, dipping into reserves he had been saving for his own old age, an act of faith in his son that moved Tobias deeply. Miriam, who had known about Tobias's feelings for Naomi long before he had confided them, contributed her own small savings, a collection of silver coins she had been setting aside for years through careful management of the household economy. The wedding was held in the late autumn, after the olive harvest but before the first rains of winter. It was a celebration that brought together two families from different social strata and, in doing so, illustrated one of the most important truths about life in a biblical city: that social boundaries, while real and powerful, were not impermeable. A man of skill, courage, and good character could cross them, not by denying them or defying them, but by earning the respect and trust that made such crossings possible. The ceremony itself was simpler than modern people might expect. There was no grand procession, no elaborate ritual, no exchange of rings. The groom arrived at the bride's house accompanied by his friends and family, received the bride from her father, and escorted her to his own home, where a feast awaited. The feast was the center of the celebration, a communal meal that lasted for hours and involved the entire neighborhood. Tables were set up in the street outside Tobias's house, food was contributed by dozens of families, and musicians played until long after midnight. The moon hung low over the city, casting silver light on the dancers and the revelers. And for one evening, the anxieties of daily life, the taxes, the political pressures, the economic uncertainties were forgotten in the simple, ancient joy of two families joining together in the hope of a shared future. Naomi moved into Tobias's house, which he had expanded and improved in preparation for the marriage. He had added a second room, replastered the walls, and built a new rooftop terrace with a low stone wall that provided privacy while still allowing the spectacular views of the city and the surrounding hills. Naomi brought her dowry, which included household goods, a small amount of silver, and, most valuably, a collection of fine textiles that she had helped weave in her father's workshop. These textiles would serve as both household furnishings and a reserve of wealth that could be traded or sold in times of need. The first months of their marriage were a period of adjustment and discovery. Naomi was accustomed to a household run by servants, and the daily labor of life in a craftsman's home was a shock to her system. She had never ground grain, never built a fire in a clay stove, never carried water from a public fountain. Miriam, who had initially viewed her new daughter-in-law with a mixture of warmth and skepticism, took on the role of teacher, patiently instructing Naomi in the skills that every woman in the lower quarter was expected to master. Naomi learned quickly, driven by a determination to prove that she was worthy of the life she had chosen, and within a few months she was managing the household with a competence that earned Miriam's genuine respect. But Naomi also brought something to the household that it had never had before, a connection to the world of ideas and culture that existed in the upper quarter of the city. She introduced Tobias to texts and stories that he had never encountered, and their evening conversations on the rooftop became a kind of private education, a space where they explored questions about the world, about human nature, about the meaning of the work they did and the lives they lived. Tobias, who had always been intelligent but had lacked the vocabulary to express his deeper thoughts, found in Naomi a partner who could articulate the things he had only felt, and in this mutual discovery, they built a relationship that was deeper and more resilient than anything either of them had imagined. The city continued its ancient rhythms around them. Seasons turned. Harvests came and went. Children were born in the neighborhood and old people passed away, their places at the family table occupied by new faces that carried the features of those who had come before. The political situation grew more complicated, with new regulations and new officials arriving from the imperial capital with increasing frequency. Taxes rose again, and there was talk of a census that would require every family to register in the city of their ancestors, a logistical nightmare that would disrupt commerce and travel for months. Tobias and Naomi weathered these changes together, drawing strength from their partnership and from the community that surrounded them. Tobias's workshop continued to grow. He took on 2 more apprentices, boys from poor families in the neighborhood who would learn a trade, and in doing so gain a foothold in the economic life of the city. He began experimenting with new forms and techniques, producing vessels that combined the functional durability of traditional pottery with an artistic refinement that attracted customers from across the region. His reputation spread along the trade routes, and merchants began placing orders from cities he had never visited, requesting specific designs that they had seen in the homes of wealthy clients. Naomi, meanwhile, established herself as a respected figure in the neighborhood. Her education and her family connections gave her a unique position, a bridge between the upper and lower quarters of the city. She organized cooperative efforts among the women of the neighborhood, sharing resources during times of scarcity, mediating disputes, and creating informal networks of mutual support that strengthened the entire community. She taught reading to the daughters of families who could not afford private instruction, an act of generosity that earned her the deep gratitude of parents who understood that literacy was a tool of power in a world where most people were denied it. Their first child, a son, was born in the spring, during the barley harvest. The birth took place at home, attended by Miriam and a midwife from the neighborhood, a woman of vast experience who had helped bring hundreds of children into the world. The labor was long and difficult, and Tobias spent the hours pacing on the rooftop, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, feeling more helpless than he had ever felt in his life. When the cry of the newborn finally pierced the night, he descended the ladder so quickly that he nearly fell, and when he saw his son for the first time, a tiny, wrinkled creature with dark hair and clenched fists, he wept with a force that surprised everyone, including himself. They named the boy Azariah, which meant helped by the divine, a name that reflected their gratitude for the life they had built together. The birth of a child in a biblical city was not just a family event, but a community event, celebrated with visits from neighbors, gifts of food and clothing, and prayers offered by the local elders. For 8 days, the house was filled with visitors, and Naomi and Tobias received them all with the generous hospitality that was the highest social virtue of their culture, offering bread and wine and the warmth of a home that had been built, quite literally, from the earth beneath their feet. As the years passed, Tobias became one of the most respected craftsmen in the city. His workshop employed a dozen workers, and his pottery was known throughout the region for its quality and beauty. But success did not insulate him from the challenges that affected everyone in the city. A drought in the third year of his marriage devastated the harvest, driving food prices to levels that pushed many families to the edge of survival. Tobias used his savings to buy grain at inflated prices, sharing what he could with neighbors who had nothing. Naomi organized the women of the neighborhood to pool their resources, creating a communal kitchen that fed families who could not feed themselves. Together, they demonstrated the principle that had sustained human communities for thousands of years, that survival was not an individual achievement, but a collective one, dependent on the willingness of people to share their resources and bear each other's burdens. The drought also revealed the fragility of the political and economic systems that governed the city. The imperial authorities, focused on maintaining their revenue, did not reduce taxes despite the crisis. Farmers who could not pay lost their land, becoming tenant laborers on estates that grew ever larger as small holdings were absorbed into the properties of the wealthy. The gap between rich and poor widened, creating tensions that simmered beneath the surface of daily life like heat beneath the crust of a dormant fire. There were murmurs of discontent in the market, whispered conversations about justice and fairness that carried an edge of desperation. Tobias navigated these tensions with a care that reflected his understanding of the forces at play. He was not a political man, but he was an observant one, and he could see that the pressures building within the city were not simply economic but moral. The fundamental question was whether a community could survive when its most vulnerable members were allowed to fall into destitution, while its most powerful members accumulated wealth without limit. It was a question as old as civilization itself, and it had no easy answer. Caleb, whose work on the construction project had ended when the building was completed, found steady employment harder to come by. The new building, with its imposing facade and its foreign administrators, stood as a daily reminder of the power that controlled the city, and many workers who had helped build it now struggled to find work that paid enough to support their families. Caleb, ever resilient, adapted by offering his skills as a freelance mason, repairing walls, building cisterns, and doing whatever work came his way. He and Tobias remained close friends, and their rooftop conversations continued, now enriched by the shared experience of marriage, fatherhood, and the complicated business of growing older in a world that never stopped demanding new adaptations. One evening, Caleb told Tobias about a conversation he had overheard in the market, a discussion between two merchants about the changing patterns of trade in the region. New routes were opening, connecting cities that had previously been isolated, and new products were entering the market that competed with local goods. Caleb saw this as a threat, but Tobias, with the instinct of a man who had always understood that change was opportunity, saw it differently. If new routes were opening, then new markets were opening too. Markets where his pottery could find customers who had never seen his work. The idea took root in Tobias's mind, like a seed in well-watered soil, and over the following months, it grew into a plan that would transform not just his business, but his understanding of his place in the world. He began producing small, finely crafted vessels specifically designed for the long-distance trade. Oil lamps with intricate geometric patterns, perfume bottles with narrow necks and graceful curves, and small decorative pieces that were light enough to transport and beautiful enough to command premium prices in distant markets. He partnered with a merchant who had connections along the new trade routes, a man named Ezra who had traveled extensively and who understood the tastes and preferences of customers in cities that Tobias had only heard of in stories. The partnership was a success. Within a year, Tobias's pottery was being sold in markets 300 miles from his workshop, and the income from these sales exceeded anything he had earned from local customers. The success allowed him to invest further in the workshop, to hire more workers, to improve the quality of his materials, and to continue experimenting with new designs and techniques. But it also created new responsibilities and new pressures. Managing a workshop with a dozen employees, maintaining quality across a growing volume of production, navigating the complexities of long-distance trade, and balancing the demands of business with the needs of his family required a kind of energy and attention that tested his limits. Naomi was his anchor during these years of growth and change. She managed the household with quiet efficiency, raised Azariah with a combination of tenderness and discipline, and provided Tobias with a sounding board for his ideas and concerns. Their partnership was not without friction. They disagreed about how much risk to take, about how much to invest in the business versus how much to save for emergencies, about how to balance ambition with contentment. But their disagreements were productive, forcing each of them to examine their assumptions and to find solutions that took both perspectives into account. In this way, their marriage reflected the fundamental truth about all human relationships, that the most meaningful connections are not the ones that avoid conflict, but the ones that transform conflict into understanding. The years accumulated like layers of sediment, each one adding depth and complexity to the lives of Tobias and his family. Azariah grew from a toddler into a boy who showed his father's aptitude for working with his hands and his mother's curiosity about the world of ideas. At 7, he began his formal education, attending a small school attached to the local gathering hall where he learned to read, to write, and to memorize the traditional texts that formed the foundation of his community's cultural identity. Tobias watched his son's development with a pride that was tempered by the awareness that the world Azariah was growing into was different from the one he had known as a child, shaped by forces that were difficult to predict and impossible to control. A second child arrived, a daughter they named Hannah, whose birth brought a new dimension of joy and vulnerability into the household. Naomi, who had managed one child with apparent ease, found that two required an entirely different level of organization and energy, and she relied increasingly on the network of women in the neighborhood who had helped her establish herself during the early years of her marriage. The women of the lower quarter formed a support system that was as essential as the city's water supply, a network of shared labor, shared knowledge, and shared care that kept families functioning in conditions that would have been impossible for any single household to manage alone. The city itself continued to change. New buildings went up, old ones were repaired or demolished, streets were repaved, and the market expanded to accommodate the growing volume of trade that flowed through the city. The population grew slowly but steadily, as families from the surrounding countryside migrated inward, drawn by the opportunities and the relative security of urban life. The walls of the city, which had once enclosed a space that felt almost intimate, now seemed to press inward, and the streets grew more crowded, more noisy, more alive with the chaotic energy of a community that was outgrowing its physical boundaries. Tobias found himself reflecting more frequently on the nature of the life he was living. He had achieved things that his father had never imagined possible: financial security, social respect, a partnership with his wife that was the envy of the neighborhood, children who were healthy and well-educated. Yet he was haunted by a restlessness that he could not fully explain, a sense that the daily routine of work and family, as satisfying as it was, did not answer the deeper questions that stirred in him during the quiet hours of the night. These questions were not abstract or philosophical. They were grounded in the concrete realities of his life and his community. He saw families around him struggling with poverty, illness, and injustice, and he wondered why the systems that governed the city seemed incapable of addressing these problems. He saw talented young people denied opportunities because of their birth, and he wondered why a person's family name should carry more weight than their character and abilities. He saw the imperial authorities imposing their will on a people who had no voice in the decisions that affected their lives, and he wondered whether power without accountability was not a form of cruelty disguised as order. These thoughts found expression not in political action, which would have been dangerous, but in the way Tobias conducted his business and his life. He paid his workers fairly, at rates that allowed them to support their families with dignity. He offered apprenticeships to boys from poor families, giving them skills that would elevate their social position. He contributed to the communal funds that supported widows, orphans, and the disabled. He did these things not because they were expected of him, though they were, but because they reflected his understanding of what it meant to live a good life in a community of interdependent people. Naomi shared these values, and together they created a household that was known not just for its prosperity, but for its generosity and its warmth. Their door was always open to neighbors in need, their table always had room for an extra guest, and their willingness to help in times of crisis earned them a place in the community's collective memory that would outlast their own lifetimes. In a world without banks or insurance, where the only safety net was the goodwill of your neighbors, this kind of reputation was the most valuable asset a family could possess. The moonlit evenings on the rooftop continued to be the family's most treasured time. As the children grew old enough to participate, the conversations expanded to include their questions and observations, creating a space for intergenerational exchange that was one of the most important functions of family life in the ancient world. Azariah would ask about the stars, and Tobias would tell him what he knew about the constellations and their movements, knowledge that had been passed down from farmer to farmer for thousands of years. Hannah would ask about the families in other parts of the city, and Naomi would describe the different neighborhoods and their customs, painting a picture of a community that was far more diverse and complex than it appeared from the outside. These conversations were the threads from which the fabric of cultural continuity was woven. In a world without books, without schools in the modern sense, without any of the institutional structures that modern societies use to transmit knowledge from one generation to the next, the family gathering on the rooftop was the primary site of education, the place where children learned who they were, where they came from, and what was expected of them. The stories told on those evenings, stories of ancestors, of heroes, of great deeds and terrible mistakes, were the raw material from which identity was constructed, and they carried within them the values, the beliefs, and the aspirations that would guide the next generation through the challenges they would face. Tobias was in his workshop, shaping a large storage jar on the wheel, when a messenger arrived with news that would alter the course of his life. Eleazar, Naomi's father, was gravely ill. A fever had struck him 3 days earlier, and despite the efforts of the city's most skilled healer, his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Naomi left immediately for her father's house, leaving the children in Miriam's care, and Tobias followed as soon as he could close the workshop. The scene at Eleazar's house was somber. The family had gathered in the main room, their faces tight with worry and grief. Eleazar lay on a thick mat in the corner, his body burning with fever, his breathing shallow and labored. The healer, an elderly man named Simeon, who had been treating patients in the city for decades, had done everything he could. Herbal poultices, cooling compresses, bitter tinctures made from roots and bark. But the fever would not break, and Simeon's expression told the family what his words would not. Naomi sat beside her father, holding his hand, speaking to him in the soft, steady voice that she used with her children when they were frightened. She told him about Azariah's progress in school, about Hannah's first attempts at weaving, about the new designs Tobias was creating in the workshop. She spoke about the future as if it were certain, as if her words could build a bridge that would carry her father safely over the abyss that was opening before him. Tobias stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, feeling the tremor of suppressed emotion that ran through her body like a current through still water. Eleazar passed away in the early hours of the morning, just as the first light of dawn was turning the eastern sky from black to gray. The household erupted in the rituals of mourning that were among the most profound and deeply felt practices of the community. The women wailed, a sound that carried through the streets and alerted the neighborhood that a life had ended. Mourning in a biblical city was not a private affair. It was a communal event that involved the entire neighborhood and, depending on the status of the deceased, the entire city. Friends, neighbors, business associates, and even casual acquaintances came to the house to offer their condolences, to sit with the family in their grief, and to share memories of the person who had died. The mourning period lasted 7 days, during which the family sat on low stools or on the floor, receiving visitors and abstaining from work, bathing, and other normal activities. Food was brought by neighbors, an ancient custom that recognized the inability of a grieving family to attend to their own physical needs. Tobias took charge of the practical arrangements, coordinating with the burial society, managing the flow of visitors, and ensuring that the traditions were observed with the respect and care that Eleazar deserved. The loss of Eleazar was not just an emotional blow, but an economic one. His textile business had been the primary source of income for Naomi's extended family, and without his leadership and connections, the business was vulnerable. Naomi's brother, a capable but inexperienced young man named Ethan, stepped into his father's role, but the transition was difficult. Suppliers who had done business with Eleazar on the basis of personal trust were reluctant to extend the same terms to his son. Customers who had relied on Eleazar's judgment and expertise began looking for alternative suppliers. The business, which had been built over decades through skill, relationships, and relentless effort, began to contract. Tobias helped where he could, offering advice, introducing Ethan to his own network of merchants and traders, and even providing a small loan to cover a shortfall during a particularly difficult month. But he was careful not to overstep, aware that his help could be perceived as interference, and that Ethan's pride and sense of responsibility required space to develop. The situation tested the bonds between the two families, exposing the tensions that exist in any relationship where love and money intersect. But ultimately it strengthened those bonds, demonstrating that the alliance formed through marriage was not just a social arrangement, but a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared commitment. The passing of Eleazar also forced Naomi to confront her own mortality and the precariousness of the life she had built. She became more intentional about passing on her knowledge and values to her children, spending more time with Azariah and Hannah, teaching them not just practical skills, but the deeper lessons that her father had taught her. The importance of integrity in business, the value of education, the necessity of generosity, and the understanding that wealth was not an end in itself, but a tool for building a life of meaning and service. The years that followed were a time of consolidation and quiet growth. Tobias's workshop continued to thrive, producing pottery that was recognized as among the finest in the region. He trained a new generation of apprentices, several of whom would go on to establish their own workshops, carrying his techniques and his standards into new communities. Azariah, now a young man, showed a talent for the business side of the pottery trade, and Tobias began gradually transferring responsibilities to his son, preparing him for the day when he would take over the workshop. Hannah grew into a young woman of remarkable intelligence and determination. Like her mother, she had learned to read and write, and she used these skills to help manage the household accounts and to correspond with trading partners in distant cities. She had her mother's grace and her father's quiet intensity, and the young men of the neighborhood regarded her with the same admiration and respect that Tobias had once shown to Naomi. The city itself had changed in ways both subtle and profound. New neighborhoods had grown up outside the original walls, sprawling clusters of houses and workshops that reflected the city's expanding population and economy. The market had doubled in size, and the variety of goods available was greater than ever, including products from lands so distant that their names sounded like inventions. The old social hierarchies remained in place, but they had been complicated by the rise of new families whose wealth came from trade rather than land, and by the increasing influence of the imperial administration, which had its own hierarchy based on service to the empire rather than local tradition. Tobias observed these changes with the mixed emotions of a man who had benefited from change, but who also understood its costs. The city he had grown up in was disappearing, replaced by something larger, more complex, and in many ways more prosperous, but also more anonymous, more stratified, and less connected to the intimate, communal rhythms that had defined his childhood. The old neighbors were dying off, their houses occupied by strangers from other cities or other provinces. The old customs were evolving, adapted by each new generation to suit the conditions of a world that their grandparents would barely recognize. But some things remained constant. The sun still rose each morning over the eastern hills, painting the limestone walls with gold. The sound of grinding stones still echoed through the neighborhoods before dawn. The market still pulsed with life, a swirling mixture of languages, smells, colors, and sounds that was as intoxicating as it had been when Tobias first walked its aisles as a boy. The families still gathered on their rooftops in the evenings, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, sharing stories and plans and fears and hopes. The cisterns still collected rain, the olive trees still bore fruit, the grapevines still climbed the hillsides in orderly rows, and the bread still baked in clay ovens with a smell that had not changed in 1,000 years. On one such evening, Tobias sat on his rooftop with Naomi beside him, their children grown and beginning to build their own lives. The city spread out below them, a labyrinth of narrow streets and flat-roofed houses punctuated by the towers of public buildings and the walls that still defined its boundaries. The moon was full, hanging low over the western hills, casting a silver light that made the city look like something from a dream. Tobias turned to Naomi and said, "When I was a boy carrying water from the fountain, I used to wonder what my life would become. I could not have imagined this. Any of it. Not the workshop. Not the children. Not you." Naomi smiled and leaned against his shoulder, and they sat together in a silence that was not empty but full of memory and gratitude and the deep, quiet satisfaction of a life lived with purpose and love. And this is what it was like to live in a biblical city 2,000 years ago. Not the grand narratives of kings and empires, not the dramatic events that fill the pages of history books, but the daily, ordinary, extraordinary business of being human. The bread ground and baked each morning, the water carried from the fountain, the clay shaped on the wheel, the children born and raised and launched into the world, the friendships forged and tested and deepened by time, the love discovered and nurtured and sustained through decades of shared labor and shared joy and shared sorrow. The moon rising over the same hills that had witnessed 100 generations of human striving, casting the same silver light on streets where people had walked and worked and dreamed since before anyone could remember. 2,000 years have passed since Tobias carried his first jar of water from the public fountain, and the world has changed beyond recognition. The cities of stone have been replaced by cities of steel and glass. The clay ovens have been replaced by electric stoves. The oil lamps have been replaced by light bulbs. The handwritten scrolls have been replaced by digital screens. But the fundamental experiences of human life, the labor, the love, the loss, the hope, the struggle, the triumph, the quiet moments on the rooftop when everything falls away and all that remains is the awareness of being alive in a vast and beautiful world, these have not changed at all. They are the same today as they were 2,000 years ago, and they will be the same 2,000 years from now, because they are not products of technology or culture or history. They are products of the human heart, which beats in the same rhythm, with the same longing, in every age and every place. If you have watched this entire story, if you have traveled with Tobias and Naomi through the streets and seasons of their ancient city, then you understand something that no textbook can teach you. You understand that the past is not a foreign country. It is home. It is the place where every one of us began, and the place to which every one of us in some deep and mysterious way still belongs. If you watched all the way to this moment, it is because this story resonated with something deep inside you. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched until the end, so I can get to know you and understand who truly appreciates the stories on this channel." If this story moved you, if it made you see the ancient world in a new way, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the moment. Subscribe and turn on notifications because every week we bring you stories that connect you to the deepest truths of human history. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for remembering that the people who lived 2,000 years ago were not strangers. They were us.